I use the term mystical union. So I'm just going to lay out kind of what I mean by the terms, right? So theosis is a very popular term, as I said, in Eastern Orthodoxy. Deification is the other very popular term in Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, this is generally used to categorize teachings of the Church Fathers, like Athanasius. It's not only in Athanasius, it's in pretty much all of the Church Fathers. It's very significantly in Augustine. It's very significant in someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, who becomes the probably most influential popular medieval theologian on Luther, because maybe Tauler is a little more influential. And then whoever wrote the anonymous Theologia Germanica, which we don't know who the author is, was very influential on Luther. But actually, all three of those authors are very theosis-centric theologians. They all talk about participation in God a lot. Now, that doesn't mean that when I am using the term theosis, what I mean by it is exactly what the Eastern Orthodox Church means by it. So, if you go to your local priest, say in the Orthodox Church of America or whatever, church you have near you, and you ask him about theosis, the answer that he gives you is, the priest will give you is not exactly the same as what I'm talking about here. So I'm not saying that this doctrine is the same as what the East is saying. What I am saying, though, is whether you are Lutheran or Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, as the more kind of historic traditions, and we could talk about the Reformed do to some extent, but all of us have roots in the same figures, right? Like we're all reading the same Church Fathers. And the problem is, if we start saying theosis is just an Eastern Orthodox doctrine, you're basically giving the Fathers to the Eastern Orthodox. You're basically saying, hey, yeah, the Eastern Orthodox, they agree with the Fathers are theirs, because the Fathers all talk about theosis. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. Because when you read the Fathers, they're talking about theosis, we've got all the same stuff in our tradition too. The East goes in a different direction with it. And there are reasons for that. Some of it in the early church, primarily Pseudo-Dionysius, who Luther himself is quite critical of, because Luther sees Pseudo-Dionysius as a kind of a Christless view of divinization. I tend to agree with Luther. I think he's right in his evaluation. And Pseudo-Dionysius, his book, The Divine Names, and other works become really central for the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And then the East is formed through the hesychastic movement and Maximus Confessor, and there are all these other figures that shape the Eastern view. But once we get back to the Athanasius or the Cappadocian Fathers, we're looking at the first 5 centuries of the Church. They belong to all of us. Like, they don't just belong to Rome or the East. In some significant ways, I think they belong to us in ways that don't align, depending on the Father, with those traditions. But so what the Lutheran tradition does is largely develops its doctrine of participation with God in the language of the mystical union. So that tends to be the way that Lutherans talk about it. And in a way, I would say the mystical union kind of is our take on theosis, is the language I would use. So the mystical union is just a way to say, first of all, it's mystical, which I know people shy away from the term mystical, because I think people have a misunderstanding of mysticism. When people think mysticism, they often think of maybe a New Age stuff, or they think of you just need to listen to God speak in your heart and not read the Bible or something. And Luther's plenty critical, and that we call that enthusiasm. Mysticism can be that, don't get me wrong, but it can mean lots of other things as well. Luther himself would largely be considered a mystic in one kind of tradition of mysticism. But by the mystical, we mean that largely there is mystery around what's going on. There is an inexplainable nature of this union. This is something that human words can't really grasp at. We just have some analogies. We've got a number of analogies. We got the temple, because we see a picture of that. We obviously got plenty of that in the Old Testament, but Paul used the language of the temple. We've got the sexual union, the marriage union. We have vine and branches. Right, I am the vine, you are the branches. I don't think the branches are aligning their moral wills with the vine, and that's how they align themselves. Right? No, he's the life source. They're literally physically connected. So that's a picture of our literal, real, intimate connection that we have with Jesus that's being used there. But ultimately, these are all analogies to get at something that is ineffable. It's inexplainable in its fullness, which perhaps is why a lot of people don't like it, because we like things that we can explain, right? And this is something you find in the Lutheran Orthodox in the 17th century, where this doctrine really develops in its most precise forms, is that as they're talking about this union, they say a lot more about what it isn't than what it is. And that could be a little frustrating because you want to know more. But that's kind of what we're left with, because it is mysterious. And they do outline some important things, what it's not. One is, it's not you literally becoming God. Okay? So Lutherans do, by the way, use Athanasius' phrase, but they usually change it a little bit. Okay? Johann Gerhard cites it, C.F.W. Walther cites it in a couple sermons. But both of them say, well, I guess one says God, the Son of God became man, that man might become sons of God. Or God became man, that man might become like God. Just to kind of put a little clarity. And that's really what Athanasius means, okay? And I think the clarification is helpful, especially if you live in an area like, I assume you got a lot of Mormons in this area, don't you? So you don't want to be a little careful here, okay? But I like that rendering of the phrase to say that, the Son of God became man, that man might become a son of God. I think that gets at really the reality of what Athanasius was getting at. So in terms of those negations, they start to say, well, here's what it's not. It's not you literally becoming God. It's not a hypostatic union, which is the language used for Jesus. In other words, you're not united with God in the same way that the human nature of Jesus is united with God. You don't get to say, in other words, because God dwells in you, I am God. That would be blasphemy, okay? That wouldn't be, Jesus can say that, you cannot say that, okay? So these are boundaries of orthodoxy around what you can and cannot say. Similar kind of language is used when we're talking about how the natures of Christ relate. What is a divine nature? Well, do you know what a divine nature is? Here, who can give me a perfect definition of divine nature? Obviously you can't. So how do a human and divine nature actually relate? In its fullness, we don't really know that. We're just using what we know to kind of negate what it's not. Here are the boundaries. Don't talk outside of these boundaries, because you're going to move into heresy in one way or another. The mystical union is very similar. So another term the term that I have used, and I have a book of this title, is Christification. And the reason I chose that particular title is that I think it really centers us on what we're really talking about in this idea of theosis, at least from a Lutheran approach, is they're really just talking about what Christ does for us and then in us, which is a result of what he does for us. And that, when Athanasius uses this language, the foundation is Jesus' own life. The foundation is not even you here now. It's objective in what Jesus did for you. He united humanity with divinity in his incarnation. There's an accomplished fact of that. And what we experience in life is a subjective reception of that and living out the reality that is true about Jesus himself. So to keep that kind of Christological center, which is always going to be kind of the Luther's principle, and I think rightly so, that Christification idea gets at, I think, to say we're really talking about something that is true about the incarnation, and it's centered on the work of Jesus. Because what you get in some of the especially kind of Dionysian, so Pseudo-Dionysius, he's called Pseudo-Dionysius because there was a Dionysius that traveled with Paul, and some early church fathers thought this document was written by that Dionysius because it said it's written by Dionysius. We don't know who the author was or if his name was even Dionysius. He could have just been using that title, but it also wasn't that uncommon of a name, so it very well was just some other guy named Dionysius. Anyway, it becomes associated with the guy that Paul knew, and so therefore it becomes, well, he's mentioned in the New Testament, so what he says is authoritative. But if you read Dionysius, there's not a lot about Jesus. There really isn't. It's more about mystical contemplation, and that mystical contemplation is largely a contemplation that is a kind of lacking of thought. It's apophatic theology, and there's some truth to it, but essentially, the way that we know God best is by negating our ideas about God, because God is beyond thought. He's beyond any limited concept that we have. And of course, there's truth to that. Certainly, the New Testament and Old Testament use language of what God is not. And it's true that our language doesn't grasp him. We speak analogously about God. But at the same time, I just don't see that language about our spiritual life and prayer urged in the New Testament. I just don't. So I think our focus in this always has to be on Jesus. And so I'll say this, kind of in summary, how does this, theosis work? I think when we're looking at what Paul says to the Corinthians, he speaks about being in the presence of God and God transforming us. Right? It's Moses on the mountain. Ultimately, where are you in the presence of God? Where do you see the presence of God? In his word, in the sacraments, the gift of the body and blood of Christ in the Holy Eucharist. That's where you receive Jesus. That's where you meet God. So when I'm talking about this idea of theosis, I'm not talking about this mystical, separate contemplation of like you going alone on a mountain somewhere. Not that you can go ahead, there are nice mountains around here. Go ahead, go on a mountain and pray. That's great. But the root of everything is being before Christ and receiving him where he has promised to be. And as a result of that, he forms himself in us as we are conformed to his image. All right, thank you.